Well, let's read from God's Word, shall we? I've chosen for us this morning to have a think about Psalm 62. It sort of came, there were a couple of verses in the chapter that came to me, and it was only sort of after I'd done quite a lot of preparing that I came to verse 7, which mentions rock, and thought, oh, people will think I've chosen this because of Gibraltar. That could not be further from the truth. I want to make that point up front. I hadn't even realised the word rock was in there until I got about halfway through my study, and so I think whether one is facing a time of trial and difficulty, or whether one is, I don't know what phrase do we use these days, motoring ahead, charging ahead with the Lord, riding the crest of a wave. This psalm is intensely relevant to all of us. And, as with many of, if not all of his psalms, when David writes, he writes passionately from the heart, doesn't he? And that comes through in the words, even now, a good 2,000 years after they were written. Psalm 62. My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I shall never be shaken. How long will you assault a man? Would all of you throw him down this leaning wall, this tottering fence? They fully intend to topple him from his lofty place. They take delight in his lies. With their mouth they bless, but in their hearts they curse. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I shall not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart to him, for God is our refuge. Low-born men are but a breath. The high-born are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they are nothing. Together, they are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or take pride in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. One thing God has spoken, two things have I heard, that you, O God, are strong, and that you, O God, O Lord, are loving. Surely you will reward each person according to what he has done. I want us to focus on this particular psalm this morning, particularly verses 5 onwards, but why did I come to this particular psalm? Well, it was when a certain person in a loud voice a couple of weeks ago shouted, the eyes to the right, 308, the nose to the left, 325, the nose have it, the nose have it. When he says that, it sounds as if he's talking about nose, I think, but there we are. And of course, what was that? That was John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons, announcing that the confidence vote in the government had failed because the people who voted for it, the ayes, because it was proposed, at 308 were less than those who voted against it, 325. And that was the biggest, and of course that followed on from a vote that the government lost by a very large margin, but you'll be very glad to know that that's where I stopped talking about the B issue. I'm not going to mention it again in the sermon. But it did get me thinking about confidence. Because there were people who voted one way on one issue, but on another way they voted entirely differently because they had confidence in their leader for their own reasons at the time. And I was actually reading a little devotional a day or two beforehand, which came back to me. And it was someone who had suffered a series of personal misfortunes, and really it had been one disaster on top of another. Family bereavement, followed by friends deserting them, followed by employment terminating. You start to stack those up. And for many of us, who are working it, you just think those three, any one of those in isolation. But these three things happened in fairly quick succession. And to be honest, that is enough for many people to create a crisis of confidence and crisis of faith. And I was really touched by what they wrote. They said, "Yet there was one thing I knew for certain. God was still with me. No, I couldn't see him. And if I'm honest, I couldn't sense him. But I held on to the hope that knowing Christ had instilled in me that I could go nowhere from his presence, nowhere from his grace, even when I felt utterly, desperately weak and broken, somehow, in the most ironic way, and despite everything falling apart, my confidence in God actually deepened." Those were really powerful words. They came back to me. I wanted to share them this morning. And I know I'm doing the first bit, Steve, but I almost wondered whether if I send them to you, they might be put in the Connect magazine as well. But I'm going to read them again because they made such a profound impact on me, because I started to think back to times when, and I've never had this scale of difficulty. Yet there was one thing I knew for certain. God was still with me. No, I could not see him or even sense him, but I held on to the hope that knowing Christ had instilled in me that I could go nowhere from his presence, his care, or his grace, even when I felt utterly, desperately weak and broken, somehow in the most ironic way, and despite everything falling apart, my confidence in God actually deepened. Now, you may be here this morning and asking, well, how is that possible? How, under those circumstances, is that possible? And I want to say that if you don't know Jesus Christ in a real, living and personal way, that is indeed possible. In fact, it is the only thing that really matters when things are falling apart around you. Because the keys to finding confidence don't rely on ourselves, not in the things we have done, not in the things that we hope might happen in the future, but they lie in him. They don't rely on any other activity that we may engage in. And David, I think, had that same sense of insight here in Psalm 62. The background to the psalm: David was being pursued by his persecutors, even his own son, Jonathan. They were trying to wrestle the throne away from him. He was a fugitive. He was the king, and yet he was a fugitive. He was having to run. He was having to hide. And yet in all of that, he was inspired to write Psalm 62. And, it starts in the same way as it finishes. My soul finds rest in God alone. He came to that point when he had nothing, when everything seemed against him. And in that emptiness, he got the clarity. He had the one thing that mattered. He had the one thing that was most important. Today, friends, we have so much going on in our lives. There is so much noise out there that sometimes I think we struggle to take time to just be able to pause and reflect on how great our God really is. We get caught up in all the activities of life, the pace of things. And as a result of that, our confidence almost moves, and it's linked to what's going on at the time. And therefore, if things are going well, our confidence is up. And if things are going badly, then our confidence is down. That's not the barometer we should be using. That's not where we should be gaining our strength and sufficiency from. And just to sort of pull out some sort of points here that I think David is making, and for me the first of those really is in verse 5, because verses 1 to 4, he's setting the scene, he's assuming we all know the background to the fact that he's a fugitive, and then he sort of brings it back together in verses 5 to 12, and for me in verse 5 here, and I've just remembered I did do a slide. Well done, thank you, Elliot. I'd completely forgotten I put that. That's the only reason I do one, because I haven't got a watch that does that. No, only kidding. But so 4 points. I might as well do them now. So 4 points to remember and take home today. Verse 5, finding rest in God. God being the mainstay of our lives, as David opens that up in verses 6 and 7. Verse 8, can I stress that first word? It's not that we trust in the Lord, but we fully trust in the Lord. And then 9 to 12, I think, David nicely just reinforces that for us by reassuring us that nothing compares with God. So, here, verse 5, David's in the position where his son's taken over the throne, and, he has people pursuing him, they're looking for him, and their reason for doing so is very simple. They want to kill him. He's a fugitive. His own family have not only turned their back on him, but they're actively pursuing him. And David comes here, and he's realized that his salvation, his hope, comes from one source alone, and that is from his God. And that's why he can rest in God. But as we come to verse 5, I think there's another dimension that starts to open up here, because it's not just that his salvation comes from God, but it's like a light bulb moment for him. What comes out is that his conviction in God is sufficient as well. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him. Whereas in verse 1, it's, my soul finds rest in God alone. That's a statement of fact. Whereas by verse 5, he's not simply making the statement, he's actually applying it to himself. Find rest, my soul. Find it in God alone. He's realized that not only is God the source of that rest, but God, is all-powerful and will give him that complete sense of rest. Is it just me, or I tend to be a bit of a worrier on times, and often things will come onto my mind late at night, and I can tell you now, if I go to bed, even if it's late, and I'm worrying or thinking about something, I don't need Pro Plus or caffeine or anything to keep me awake. Just the fact that I've got something turning over in my mind means, I seem to be awake for ages, and you keep looking at the watch, the clock at the side of the bed every half an hour, thinking, why haven't I fallen asleep yet? Well, and you go back to thinking about whatever it is that's on your mind, on the go, keeping you going. I'm sure I'm not the only one who does that. How many sleepless nights do we have because things weigh on our mind, weigh on our soul? Life was screaming at David here, but instead of worrying whether, his hiding place was good enough, would they know where he is? Would someone remember the sort of places he would go? Would those who were pursuing him find him? Would it be a quick death or a slow death? He managed to tune all of that out and focus on the one person that really mattered. He's, as he ministers to himself here, it's a tremendous opportunity because he ministers to us as well. Find rest, O my soul, in God alone. My hope comes from him. If we're going to want rest, then we have to be looking beyond that situation to where our hope comes from. And that's what David was starting to do here in verse 5. And then he just notches it up a little bit more in verse 6, doesn't it? Because he's not just saying that his God is a source of hope. Look at it. He alone, he says. He alone. It really doesn't matter what follows after that. In this case, he talks about my rock, my fortress, my salvation. But it doesn't really matter what adjective he puts there, because the two most important words are those first two words in verse 6. He alone. Do we put that same confidence and trust in God our Saviour? Or is it a case of, well, he with a little bit of help from me? Or he alone, but just in case he's not watching, I'll also do this? Do we sometimes try to sort of reinforce things just in case? Because, he's got a lot of people to worry about. 7 billion people in this place. No, my friends, he knows every hair on our head. He does. So, and that's what amazes me about this particular passage and David's sort of sense of peace of mind. I'm not sure, if I'm out hiding and the army's looking for me, I could have written these words. I don't think I could have done. I don't think I would have measured up to the sense of peace. Or maybe the truth was that in that situation, he could write these words because God gave him that peace. Because it's a divine peace, not a human peace. And that's something that we can and we should apply when we face difficult times, when we face times of trial and bereavement, because they will come. There are seasons. We know that. And I said, David develops this, into verse 6 and 7, where he's talking about what I called making God the mainstay of our lives. And that's an old word, I know, mainstay, but I couldn't think of a better word that really captures it. It's more than being at the centre, because if you have something at the centre, you tend to find things outside the centre. But the mainstay for me was, he is all-encompassing, and he is, our rock, our salvation, our stronghold, our pure source of safety. And Jesus uses this pattern as well. He applies it himself in his own teaching. If we think of Matthew chapter 7, when we think of the wise and the foolish builder, he's talking about making sure that if you're going to build something, you do it on that strong foundation. You don't build the house on the sand, but you build it on something of substance. So we get the rock and the sand illustration there. But then more subtly, if you think about it, in Matthew chapter 6, when he talks about collecting treasures on earth. And I think this is perhaps more important for us as we are so affluent. Don't go placing your confidence in the things we have around us. Recognize that our dependence and our trust really do need to be in him. And if we don't do it, then we will be restless. Here, David had an incredibly difficult situation, but God had managed to give him that divine sense of peace as he worked through it. So, finding his rest in God and God being the mainstay of his life in verses 6 and 7. And then he goes on a bit further in verse 8 and starts to sort of broaden that out. And I think this is quite a challenge for us in terms of how we take that trust and actually apply it in our lives. And two words here that stood out for me was this description he was using about pouring out. I don't know whether you spotted that there in verse 8. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts to him. for he is your God is our refuge. The word he's using here, and I'm not a great Hebrew scholar. In fact, I'm not a Hebrew scholar at all, but I do have commentaries that have words written by Hebrew scholars, so I'm having to rely on that and pull that in. And but the term used here, the original Hebrew, is the same word that's used for pouring a liquid out of a container, but it's a liquid that's quite concentrated, and therefore you can't just do that and it suddenly all shoots out and there's nothing left in the container. You're almost there shaking it, shaking the container, holding it to get that last drop, as it sort of stretches off the neck of the container until gravity finally wins the battle, and it falls. And so it's about, then there's no reserve, there's nothing left in that container, you've got everything out. And that's the sense here that David is trying to convey, that if we are to pour our hearts out to him, we're not to be half-hearted. It links back to the sense of trust, isn't it? Don't do it in some measure, do it completely. I tried to think of an example of that. Hands up who's done a parachute jump here? Anyone? I think one. Sally, you've done a skydive. Oh, that counts. Did you put 10% trust in the parachute, or 100%? I'm just wondering if we were all in a small plane and we had the chance to jump, and and someone said, "Look, we've put parachute bags on your back. I'm just been told by the captain that one of the bags has been mispacked. Under the circumstances, it's going to be fine for all of us bar one. Everyone okay to jump still?" Let's assume there were 100 people jumping. You've got a 1 in 100 chance. I won't go into too much maths. I can do it as an insurance. You've got a 1 in 100 chance that you've got the deficient parachute. 99 of these parachutes will be fine. Only one isn't going to work, and there's 100 of us. Hands up who would still jump with 1% doubt. Is that because your confidence is in the Lord and it's a quicker way to have it? Yeah. No.
I think I want to go last.
Good point. Good point, Stuart. Do you see why pour out are the two most important words in this particular verse now? We can't talk about having confidence in the Lord and then put it in percentage terms without it being 100%, can we? It's one or the other. I don't think I've never done a parachute jump. I've had the opportunity a few times. I think I've bottled it because I don't think I've got the confidence in the parachute. What is our level of trust and confidence in our Lord? We're talking about the master of creation here. We're talking about someone who sustains this world in which we live. We're talking about someone who came and died in our place. My friends, how can it not be 100% confidence in him? So, verse 8, fully trust in him. And then, if we haven't quite got the message, David just rams it home. And over the next 3 verses, just makes the point that nothing compares with our God. Nothing compares with it. And you've got this lovely verse 9, and I think prefer some of the words because they're more poetic from the authorized version here that talks about us as a vapor. Low-born men are but a breath, the high-born are but a lie. It's like, in an instant, he dismisses everyone, doesn't he? Here, we're just of such insignificance and inconsequential. He's making the point that we are, when he refers to us as a vapour, he makes the point, we're just here and we're just gone. We're just nothing. For all our self-importance, and we do think we're important on time, we are, in the overall scheme of things, nothing. And he too then goes on to talk about some of the traps that we can be caught in, the trap of wealth, the trap of pride, before bringing it back. And when I first read verse 11 years ago, I got a bit confused. I thought that, every book has a mistake in it somewhere, and this book has got one as well, because they talk about one thing and then they talk about two things. Surely don't they mean two things have God spoken and two things have I heard? But no, I think if you look at that verse more clearly, what he's doing is he's just plumbing the depths of what God is saying. One thing God has spoken, two things have I heard, that you are strong and that you are loving. In other words, not only do you have these abilities, these attributes, but you apply them. And the whole of history is evidence of that. And that's the relationship we can have in him. So let's go right the way back to the beginning. The person who lost loved ones, lost family, lost their employment, and said actually, they didn't say it was a great experience, but they said through that experience, their confidence, their faith in God deepened. And if we're going to have that ourselves, we do need to totally trust him.